guess I could start off if you wish, and that is the fact that I'm George Barrett. I've been on the board for 20-odd years. Here's George McEvoy here, who started everything and still is involved with us. And over there is Ted Foss, who's done, I think Ted was here probably when they brought the station down here.
Shortly thereafter.
So he was, and he's been a friend of George's for all that time. And Ted has seen the whole village come together over a period of years. And we are sitting in the Freeport station that, as I understand it, was built in 1912 for Freeport, Maine, and moved up here in 1966 or 65?
64.
64, okay.
We opened in 65.
Okay.
And how did this all come about?
Well, the station was a freight station after the passenger service ended in Freeport, and it was mainly handling mail, and there was a mail train that came by at 9 o'clock every night, and I knew the station agent, and when they mailed out the LL Bean catalogs, he would call me up. I lived nearby, teaching school, and I had free time if I planned for it, and I would go down on certain nights whenever the catalogs came out to load about 4 of these Adams carts piled high with bags of catalogs, which were very, very heavy. And the train came in about 9:03 and left at 9:07. So we had about 4 minutes to load. I don't know what the poundage was, but it was a tremendous undertaking to load all these bags of mail into the baggage car, the mail car, and off it went to Portland. And one day I came by here to visit with the agent, and on the door here there was a sign, this station will be closing in such and such a date in the near future, you know, a month or two ahead. And this was a notice to all concerned, and I said, wow, what's going to happen? He said, well, they're going to move me somewhere else to another station, and this will be closed up and not a stop on the railroad anymore. So I said, what are they going to do with the station? So he made some inquiries, and they said, well, they would sell it, but you had to remove it from the property and restore the foundation to the way it looked before they built the station. In other words, fill in the cellar hole, remove the foundation, and leave the area smooth. So, all right, how do you buy the station? So it was a bidding process, and I'm not going to say exactly what I bid, but it was in the $100 range of a few $100s. I mean, ridiculously cheap for a building like this. I just put it in. It's not a joke, but I mean, if nobody else wants it, you know, I would take it for very little money. And actually, nobody else. There was one other bid, and I don't know what it was, but they notified me that I owned the station one time. So I had the winning bid of the Freeport station, and I don't recall a deadline to get it out of there, but it was verbally agreed upon that I would get started, and I located a building contractor, Frank Greenleaf, who did a lot of projects in the Brunswick area and home builder. He was a home builder. He did all the Alfred Center's work at Center's department store and that type of thing. He lived in Westport, and I contacted him to see if he could cut this building up in sizes and load them on a truck, or several trucks, to truck it away. And we had to determine the size of the pieces that we were going to move by the clearance on the old Carlton Bridge in Bath over the Kennebec River. And whatever would fit height-wise and width-wise, we were, that was determining the size of the pieces that would be cut up. So the station ended up being cut up in 9 pieces. And then the project was, how do we get it moved to Boothbay? It would be quite an expensive deal. And John Gould, the author up in Lisbon Falls, the writer for, he wrote for the Christian Science Monitor column periodically, and he wrote several books. One was The Fastest Hound Dog in the State of Maine. It was one of his famous books. But he was a colorful fellow, and he came up with the idea that the trucking industry is always butting heads with the railroad industry, and regarding hauling freight. Wouldn't it be nice to get a picture of a railroad station on a truck? So he contacted Kennebec Trucking and Rigging down in South Portland, who moved large objects all over the state of Maine, and they had some humongous big trucks, and they had the Maine Truck Owners Association get behind this whole project, and they moved this building at cost pretty much. They gave me a good break in the normal rate of moving a building 50 miles or whatever to Boothbay. So that worked out, and then we had to get over-the-road permits, and the state police knew me to some extent in the Brunswick area, and they were helpful in lining up the details to accompany us down here. 3 moves a day for 3 days. We had 9 pieces, and it was a matter of tying up Route 1 and all that periodically. So it was a big effort on a lot of people's part to get this here. And after we owned the place, I didn't know where to put it. I lived over in Southport, and I was teaching school, and I had a collection of railroad memorabilia that I wanted to get out of my father's and mother's house and put it in a separate building. Well, this would be perfect. And that's how it all started. And then someone said, well, why don't you put it in Boothbay or Boothbay Harbor, where more of the public would see it, preferably on the main road, and maybe you could open it up to the public. That's, I didn't even, I was going to just make this a private building to house a collection of stuff. And so then Ethlyn Giles, who was a real estate agent that my folks dealt with periodically, was a good friend of mine, and she went on the search for some property on Route 27 and came up with this field that we're now turned into the Boothbay Railway Village. And it was a hayfield and woods. And it was owned by the Lane family across the street, and we made a deal to purchase 15 acres of property there. And Mrs. Lane, when she found out what I was doing, she got quite interested in it, and she became quite friendly with me, and she wanted me to do the best I could do, and she said, well, look, if you buy the 15 acres, I'll give you 15 more out back up to the power line. So I ended up with 30 acres of a lot of the land we've never even hardly developed or even walked on yet, but because it's a long, narrow lot, and we're only using about the front third of the property at the present time, but we do have plenty of room for expansion. So, so we got the building sitting here in the field, and then we had to put a foundation in, lay out a little driveway out front, and then we were happy with that project, and that was going to be it again. But then people said, you got to have something moving. You got to have why don't you have a little railroad here? So you got the station. So I'm gullible, and I listened to them, and people came up with ideas where they could find used track, and the main central said they had a lot of used ties that were still good, and we could cut them in half and build a narrow gauge railroad if we wanted to. And then I noticed in Trains magazine an ad for some steam locomotives over in Germany that were 2-foot gauge, built by Henschel, and I ended up buying one sight unseen for not too much money, and shipping it to Boston. And believe it or not, when I went to Boston to get them, there were 2 other locomotives on the ship, and they went up to Laconia, New Hampshire, and ran at a steam village up there near the main road just south of Laconia, and they closed up, and believe it or not, those engines are now on the property here with their little sister engine that came over with them, and we have all 3 here in Boothbay now operating virtually on a daily basis. And so building the railroad was about a 1.5-year effort. We had to lay out the track. I rented some friends that worked on the main central, Calum Tukey, I called him K. Tukey, out of Newcastle, and Alfred Boucher out of Bath, who were section foremen up on the Rockland branch. And they befriended me and started coming down here and volunteering, so we got a loan from the bank to pay these fellas, you know, to help build this railroad. And we worked every Saturday for 8 hours building this railroad right through the winter, and get it ready for let's see, it would be early 1965. We had the circle almost completed. We had a little motor car, and we took people for a little ride around here on a Model A powered motor car. And then the engines came shortly thereafter, and I did not know how to run a locomotive any more than flying a Flying Fortress airplane, so that was another problem. And by then I had gotten to know Ted pretty well, and he was in the state police in the area, and he'd come up and watch the progress, and he didn't know anything about steam engines, and there was a fellow over in Southport, he went by when they were unloading the engine. He said, he pulled in, and his name was Van Walsh, and he worked for Curtiss Wright Aircraft at one time, and he was retired, and he had a little railroad in New Jersey with some main locomotives from the S.T. Warren plant running at his place, but he had repowered them with V8 engines, so he had to invest with steam, but he didn't know how to run steam, and he said, well, I'll be up tomorrow after you unload it, and I'll show you how to run the engine. So Sunday morning we built a fire, and off we went. And he taught me the basics of running the locomotive. And it was pretty primitive. I had a coach built by Cecil Pierce, who he didn't know a thing about railroads. He was a fire chief and a lobsterman and a boat builder over in Southport. And he built that coach. in his boatyard, along with a helper, Fred Murray, who passed away a couple of years ago up in Edgecombe. And they didn't have any plans to go by until Gus Pratt, a local historian on railroads, provided them with the building plans for a coach that ran out of Wiscasset on the Wiscasset, Waterville and Farmington Railroad. And we had to shrink the plans, the length of the car by 10 feet and the width 6 inches. We had to shrink the car enough to get around our sharp bends that we have on the railroad, because we got about just under 8/10 of a mile, 7/10 of a mile, and a little more. So some of our corners are fairly sharp. So we had to build the car a little shorter to comfortably go around the corners. And it's sitting right out front now, and it's been hauling people here now for 52 years. But we now have several coaches, some original narrow gauge from in the state of Maine, from the Bridgeton, Saco River and Sandy River and Rangeley and that type of thing. We have the original caboose, and then we have an open car that was built by the employees here, plus another one that came up from the railroad in New Jersey, which Van Walsh, after he closed up his railroad down there, he was quite interested in this, and we ended up with his equipment. So the rolling stock, some of them didn't have wheels, and I was lucky enough to find out that down in Whitensville, Massachusetts, there was a narrow gauge railroad at the White Machine Plant, and they had a small diesel, and they had some flat cars that they used in their operation at White Machine, moving big heavy pieces of equipment around, and they had a little railroad on site, you know, on that property, and that ceased to exist, and I purchased everything that they could drum up that had railroad attached to it, and we brought up a whole trailer truckload of paraphernalia, shall we say, from their railroad, including, you know, nice wheel trucks to put under our coaches and stuff like that. Well, I ran it as a privately run business for several years, and there again we'd have to research the actual dates, because it's all in the records of the history of the museum. But it got to the point where we were growing faster than the money would come in on ticket sales to enlarge. We were offered some other buildings from the main central. We have now probably 25 buildings on the property. We built the country store to be more or less a store to sell railroad books and memorabilia of their visit to the museum, and that helps fund our operation. But we had to build that building, and then we got into antique autos, and we've been through 2 museums, auto museums. We had one out back, which has now been torn down, but we now have a large one to replace it, and that's very popular. But so obviously we were spending more money than we were taking in, so we became we applied to be a nonprofit organization, educational organization, to preserve Maine history, and now we can receive funding from donations and that type of thing, and we get some tax advantages being non-profit and so on. So it's still is a probably a losing process, but at least it's not, it's spread out, the losses are spread out more, and we take in a lot of money, but it's very costly to run, especially with insurance and wages and all that type of thing. We have a board that's been very very sincere about writing out the problems we have here and working them out. And some of the board members have been on, like George here, 25 years, and Ted, ever since we opened, you know, he's been around, and most of our board have been with us for decades, shall we say. And then we have some new folks that come and go, and some people find they don't have the time to meet periodically. So, but we have a good board of directors, and we're always looking for some additions to that, and we're very fortunate in that department.